This episode contains graphic depictions of violence. Listener discretion is advised. The summer of 1897 was a particularly hot one in New York City. On June 26th, a group of ragamuffin boys were roaming the banks of the East River when one of them noticed something bundled up and bobbing in the surf. This was a busy shipping lane, and for years these boys had fished interesting items out of New York's East River. Without a second thought, one of the boys dove in, on a mission to retrieve the mystery package. A few minutes later, he re-emerged on the shore, dripping wet and dragging his loot behind him. The boys gathered round to inspect their prize. The package was heavy and waterlogged. It'd been carefully wrapped in a bright red oilcloth. One of the boys stuck it with a knife, and a red ooze trickled out. Perhaps it was a piece of meat that had fallen off a passing ship. The curious boys huddled in closer as the first boy began to unwrap the mysterious package, cutting loose the bindings around the red cloth. When the straps were loose, the boys began peeling back the outer layers of the wrapping. And then, there it was. "Oh, one of the lads shouted, stumbling backwards. These were hardened New York street kids, but even they weren't prepared for what laid before them on that rocky riverbank on this sweltering day in 1897. It was a bloody torso, a man's chest to be exact. No head, it had been removed, and no legs. They'd been sawn off as well. Both arms, quite muscular, were still attached. The boys shrieked, then scrambled in unison up the rocky embankment towards the city. About an hour later, a worker for the New York City morgue pulled up. He loaded the gruesome discovery into the back of his wagon and drove to the morgue. He was mostly unfazed. The Bellevue morgue was not a pretty place. A turn-of-the-century metropolis like New York produced bodies daily. Those killed in accidents, overdoses, murder victims, and more. The bodies often overwhelmed the morgue staff, piling up and emitting the stomach-churning stench of decomposing flesh and embalming fluids. The agent on duty that day initially thought the headless torso was just a discarded medical cadaver. But upon closer inspection, he observed that the head and legs had been brutally hacked off. This was not the careful work of an aspiring surgeon. Furthermore, the remains were kind of fresh. He estimated this person, whoever it was, had been alive less than a day before. Suspecting foul play, he alerted the authorities. The next day, in another part of the city, a man and his two sons were out picking blueberries in the smothering summer heat when they happened upon their own mysterious bundle, also wrapped in a red oilcloth. They cautiously untied the package and were met with a similar horror as those boys on the riverbank. Their discovery? An abdomen and two legs. This was the other half of the unknown victim. When the ravenous New York press found out about this latest discovery, it was on. The papers were flooded with questions. Who was this unknown man? Who killed him? Why did they kill him? And more disturbingly, where was the head? Now, like today, New York City was the largest media market in the country. It counted at least a dozen daily newspapers ferociously competing for eyeballs. All these papers, however, they weren't equal. The two bulls of the group were the New York Journal and the New York World, bitter rivals when this story broke in 1897. The New York World was owned by a man named Joseph Pulitzer, the namesake of the renowned Pulitzer Prize. Pulitzer and his New York World paper had been the alpha dog of the New York newspaper scene. He was wildly wealthy and extremely powerful. He was also older, a seasoned newspaperman. His rival, the New York Journal, was owned by a young, up-and-coming media mogul named William Randolph Hearst. Hearst had come to New York by way of California just a few years earlier. and he came armed with a mountain of cash inherited from family-owned gold mines. When Hearst set up his newspaper operation in New York, he had one goal: topple Pulitzer's mighty New York World as the most powerful player in news in the most powerful city in America. So, when this headless torso story breaks in the summer of 1897, both Pulitzer's and Hearst's men are ready to pounce. After the discovery of the lower half of the body, the race was on. The papers printed story after story, making wild guesses about the thrilling mystery of the headless torso. Perhaps this was a mafia killing, or perhaps it was a new Jack the Ripper working the New York streets. But as the story progressed, things escalated. Merely reporting on the case, that was boring. The focus quickly shifted to solving the case. Both papers hired boatmen to dredge the East River in a frenzied attempt to locate the missing head. Next, one paper offered a reward to anyone who could crack the case. Not to be outdone, the other paper doubled their reward. Each paper assigned a horde of reporters to the story, and for weeks these men in derby hats zigzagged around the streets of New York on bicycles, chasing leads in Manhattan and beyond. As they churned out story after story, circulation numbers for both papers soared. New Yorkers could not get enough of the sensationalized, headless torso story. Eventually, through the 1-2 punch of journalism and law enforcement, the mystery was solved. The identity of the murdered man came into view, as did the circumstances around his death. It's a complicated story, but here's the summary. The name of the murdered man was William Goldenzuppah. He'd gotten caught up in a messy love triangle between a woman named Augusta Knack and a guy named Martin Thorne. Goldenzuppah caught Thorne in bed with Augusta and roughed him up pretty good. Shortly after, Knack and Thorne hatched a plan to murder Goldenzuppah, flee to Germany, and spend the rest of their days in bratwurst bliss. Their next move was to lure Goldenzuppah to a rented apartment in a desolate part of the city. It was an ambush. When the unsuspecting man walked in, Thorne aimed his revolver and kills him with a single shot. And this is where the crazy really sets in. The two lethal lovers make the brilliant decision to dismember the body. They chop Goldenzuppah into smaller, portable pieces that they can more easily dispose of. Next, they sink Goldenzuppah's head into a vat of plaster and bundle the two larger pieces of his body with red oilcloth and twine. The next day, they board a New York ferry and sneak to the back. They dropped the hardened plaster piece with the head into the water, and it sank instantly. Next, they cast the headless torso into the river, assuming it too would sink. Instead, it floats, bobbing up and down in the wake of the boat. This was not the plan. The two of them freak out and decide to wait to discard the lower half of the body until later. They end up dumping it in a blueberry field several miles away. Now, the way these two finally got caught was pretty incredible. It's too much to cover here, but we've got a half lick just for you Vault subscribers, which has all the crazy things journalists did to track down these killers. Once the two were apprehended, the media frenzy gets turned up to 11. The newspapers had several weeks to prepare for the blockbuster trial. When the trial began, 70 reporters packed the courtroom. Telegraph lines snaked all around the floor of the courtroom, as Pulitzer's New York World had devised a sophisticated system that would allow his newsroom reporters to listen in real time. Not to be outdone, Hearst ups the ante. This is wild. He purchases a team of world-class racing pigeon and adds them to his staff of reporters. Here's how that worked. Hearst stationed illustrators in the courtroom who quickly sketched images of the witnesses and the scenes being described. When they finished a sketch, they would roll it up like a scroll and attach it to one of the trained birds. With a quick flap of the wings, they were gone. Like pre-programmed avian robots, the birds flew a direct path to the Journal's newsroom across town. They would dart between Manhattan skyscrapers and soar high above the East River, reaching speeds up to 90 miles per hour. The flight from the courthouse to the newsroom took 2 minutes. Once they arrived, specially trained staff quickly unfurled the bird's cargo and transposed the illustrations. Moments later, the printing presses whirred to life, giving birth to the afternoon edition. By 2 p.m., excited paperboys were shouting the headlines on the streets of New York. Obsessed New Yorkers couldn't give them their penny fast enough, ready to gawk at the journal's dramatic headlines and oversized illustrations. The incredible speed of the entire process gave William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal a competitive edge over Pulitzer's New York World. The trial ended as many expected. Both Martin Thorne and his lover Augusta Knack were found guilty of killing William Goldensuppe. Thorne was sent to the electric chair and Knack was sentenced to 10 years in jail. Though New Yorkers moved on from the story, journalism never did. The relentlessness of the headless torso story rewrote the rules of American journalism, and newsrooms would never be the same. Now, news wasn't always this way. This whole fiasco ushered in a brand new era. It was an era where boring facts were replaced by thrilling storylines. An era where solving a crime was more important than reporting a crime. An era where selling papers was more important than telling the truth, and one where influencing politics was more important than reporting politics. And it was an era that perfected the adage, if it bleeds, it leads. This new sensationalized era of journalism eventually earned a name: yellow journalism. Yellow journalism is a form of reporting known for exaggerating the truth, stretching the facts, and entertaining readers over educating readers. Sound familiar? Though it's been around for 100 years, most historians agree the godfather of yellow journalism was William Randolph Hearst. After the Headless Torso story, Hearst's influence and wealth began to explode. He aggressively expanded his media empire, snatching up dailies in major cities all across the country. It was no secret that Hearst had his eye on politics, and this network of papers would become his personal PA system. And it worked. He was elected to Congress in 1903, and his political ambitions grew from there. Initially, most of Hearst's papers were in wealthy coastal cities, but it wouldn't stay that way. Eventually, inevitably, it happened. William Randolph Hearst set his affections on the American South. If only he could identify the right city. If only that city had a paper for sale. And if only that paper had a sensational story he could exploit to help grow his brand of blood-soaked journalism. If only. My name is B.T. Harmon, and you're listening to Episode 7 of CATLICK. Look, pause, feel. It's January of 1912. Atlanta is bursting with the fresh energy of a new year and desperately hoping 1912 brings less bloodshed than the nightmarish year before. The first week of January, downtown's Forsyth Theater boasts its new headlining act, magician Eric Weiss. Ads promised this: positively the first appearance here of the famous Handcuff King, direct from a tour of the universe. That handcuff king, of course, was better known as Houdini. While Houdini mystified white audiences in downtown Atlanta, the Atlanta Ripper was sharpening his own act for Atlanta's black community. On the morning of January 20th, passers-by discovered the lifeless body of a young black woman. Maybe it was a coincidence, but this was just one day shy of the year anniversary of the Ripper's first murder back in January 1911. The woman identified was Pearl Williams. They found her body in a field in Atlanta's West End neighborhood, just a few blocks from where she lived. One paper described a ghastly wound to the throat as the cause of death. Unsurprisingly, the police arrested a black man for her murder, a guy named Frank Harvey. Apparently, he had blood on his clothes and a potato knife in his pocket when police took him into custody. The year had barely begun, and the Ripper's New Year campaign was well underway. On the morning of February 6th, Atlantans awoke to a bold headline on the front page of the Atlanta Constitution. Hearst is owner of the Georgian. He'd finally done it. William Randolph Hearst had bulldozed his way into the Southern news market. 15 years after that crazy headless torso story, he'd negotiated the acquisition of a top-tier paper in the capital of the New South. The Atlanta Georgian was quickly rolled into Hearst's massive media empire. Once official, the Constitution ran 2 articles about the acquisition. Keep in mind, Hearst had acquired their main competitor, the Atlanta Georgian. The first article reported the facts. Hearst would take charge immediately. There would be no radical changes in policy or management. The paper would be devoted to, quote, the best interests of the South, end quote. And finally, that 2 of Hearst's most seasoned newspaper executives would be transferred to Atlanta immediately. The second piece was more editorial in tone, and the Constitution kept it pretty classy. They only made a passing, veiled reference to the well-known news shenanigans that Hearst was known for. Regardless of Mr. Hearst's policies or politics, there is no discounting the influence for constructive publicity that characterizes his publications. The Constitution cordially welcomes the newcomer. There is plenty of room in Atlanta. To be honest, by the time Hearst arrived in Atlanta, the Atlanta papers were already dabbling in their own watered-down version of yellow journalism. But this was different. This was the William Randolph Hearst. I have to think the Constitution staff was probably a little nervous. Would the arrival of Hearst's brand of journalism change the way news was being reported in Atlanta? Only time would tell. The smaller newspapers around Georgia took a sharp eye to the Hearst news. The Gainesville News predicted Hearst's presence would start a, quote, newspaper war in Atlanta. One paper out of the college town of Athens predicted Hearst would run for president on the Democratic ticket in 1916, and that Atlanta was his gateway to Southern voters. Other papers offered similar thoughts. But once the news died down, these smaller papers resumed their normal reporting on happenings around the state. And by 1912, they were fully fascinated by the mystery of Atlanta's unknown killer. Down in the sleepy farming town of Thomasville, the local paper ran this headline in February. Jack the Ripper has thrilling time. The lead. If Atlanta gets to be another century old and the colored population remains as it is now, both in numbers and in morals, the newspapers will record some fine day in February 2019 that Jack the Ripper has just murdered his 16,000th victim. I can only assume that for a small Georgia newspaper, trashing Atlanta while serving up a side of racism was probably a winning formula back then. The article goes on to mock Atlanta's Ripper obsession and throws some shade at the police for good measure. By far my favorite small-town news report about Atlanta's Ripper comes from the Valdosta Times. Valdosta is another small South Georgia town several hundred miles from the big city of Atlanta. In February, the paper ran a story with a headline declaring, girls to wear daggers. The story stated that a queer fashion trend had taken hold amongst Atlanta society girls. Apparently, these wealthy white girls had begun wearing tiny, jeweled daggers in gold sheaths. Now, it doesn't say how they wore these, but I'm assuming it was around their necks. The article quotes a high-class Atlanta woman. She explains that this new fashion trend is both stylish and functional. A bedazzled instrument of self-defense perfect for surviving the recent wave of crime. But it gets better. My favorite line from the article is this beautiful deadpan. The style will suit in Atlanta where rippers are plentiful. Well played, Valdosta Times, well played. The sarcasm of the small-town papers would soon be swallowed up by the arrival of some new, grim news. The body of a young black woman was found south of Atlanta on Bowen Avenue in a community called Lakewood Heights. This would be victim number 17. Alice Owens was found with her throat cut and body mutilated, though the Constitution didn't give any details beyond that. The paper noted that she'd been dragged to a gully and was found 200 yards beyond the city limits. This was the iconic pattern of a classic Ripper murder. After investigating the crime scene, police arrested 3 different men. One of them was Alice's husband, Charles. We don't know why the other 2 men were arrested, but I'm going to go out on a limb and just say there probably wasn't a whole lot of evidence connecting them to the crime. Now, the same article noted that a man named Lucky Elliott was tried and sentenced to life in prison for the murder of a woman named Ida Ferguson. Like Pearl Williams, Ida was murdered in January, but only one of the newspapers reported it. So this Lucky Elliott guy is convicted of killing Ida Ferguson. Meanwhile, 2 more Ripper murders occurred just a few weeks later. Maybe Lucky did kill this woman, but it's doubtful he was the actual Ripper. It's worth noting here that these first 3 killings of 1912 all received much less news coverage than the last few murders of 1911. They got small write-ups of only a few paragraphs buried on later pages. This leads me to believe that interest in this story must have been dying. For example, the Pearl Williams story landed on page 5 of the Constitution. It got trumped by a front-page story about a famous opera singer visiting Atlanta. The Alice Owens story? Page 7. Front-page news that day? A meeting of advertising executives and a big headline that the cost of admission to an auto show had been decreased. What small sliver of care white Atlanta did show towards these brutal killings appeared to be evaporating. After all, this was a Negro problem. I've been studying these murders for several years now. I have spreadsheets listing the victims' names and how they died. I've made scatterplot maps showing where the bodies were found. But after a while, I realized I was kind of getting numb to all of this. I've always been torn about the media fixation on gory murders and serial killers and death in general. I guess I thought that was kind of a recent thing until I started researching this story. Look at headlines from 100 years ago and you'll see tons of macabre stories about people dying in terrible ways. I do think humans are hardwired for this. I think there's something deep in our psyches that's weirdly drawn to death and dark things. I mean, just think about Halloween. We have an entire holiday dedicated to death and fear. Economists estimate that Americans spend about $9 billion a year on Halloween decorations and candy. $9 billion! And the whole concept of Halloween is kind of wild when you think about it. You walk into your kid's school and there's a bulletin board with jovial skeletons dancing under a full moon. Those are literally dancing dead people. Like, we're so obsessed with death, we package and market it even to our own children. Every parent's greatest nightmare is their child dying, yet we send them out into the streets dressed as bloody zombies, murderous pirates, demonic clowns, and cultish witches. Or even worse, Confederate generals. It's true that humans spend their whole lives obsessed with love while fearing death. We're just weird like that. And adjacent to our desire for love is our desire for empathy. I think empathy is one of the lost jewels of our modern world. I don't know where or when we lost it, but we're really struggling to get it back. And most people don't even know it's missing. But empathy, it asks a lot of us. It asks us to take our eyes off ourselves and put them on the plight of someone else. Empathy calls us out of our own heads and pushes us down into a chair, giving us a front row seat to the suffering of others. I think we struggle with empathy because we've all gotten really bad at dealing with negative emotions. If we have a device and an internet connection, we can distract ourselves literally forever. We can drown out the negative emotions with light, sound, and memes. But empathy? Empathy asks us to look, pause, and feel. So that's what I've tried to do throughout this process. Though we know almost nothing about these victims except maybe their names and addresses, I've forced myself to look, pause, and feel. I look at the life of Rosa Trice, who lived in the Pittsburgh neighborhood south of Atlanta. Though we know what happened to her on that dark night in January, I like to imagine her on a warm summer day at a backyard barbecue, laughing with a baby girl on her hip and her grandmother nearby, sitting, smiling, and beaming with pride at what a good mother Rosa had become. I look at the life of Addie Watts. She may have lived in Reynoldstown, which got its start right after the Civil War ended. It was a settlement of newly freed slaves. I imagine Addie sitting with her family bundled up in her humble home on a brisk autumn night as her grandfather told stories of what slave life was like. Though I'm sure life was still hard, I like to think of them sitting together, hopeful, singing songs and dreaming of life being better than it was. And I look at the life of Alice Williams, who lived in Lakewood Heights. Perhaps Alice had a couple of sisters that worked alongside her, washing clothes or preparing food. I like to imagine the three of them playing pranks on each other and gossiping and checking out the good-looking black guys in the neighborhood. And then I allow myself to think about these families when they received the devastating news that their mother, daughter, sister, or friend had been taken from them. I've seen 3 people die in my life. There's a very particular type of wailing that happens at the bedside of someone who just died, and you never forget it. I imagine that wailing. I imagine the tears. I imagine the unbearable loss that these families must have felt. I get that this may sound silly or corny or even showy, but I've done this little pausing empathy thing a lot throughout this process. I still do it. I think it keeps me from just logging another victim's name in a spreadsheet. I look, pause, and feel. And I believe that keeps my humanity intact and my empathy strong. Meanwhile, back in Atlanta, empathy isn't faring too well. But fear, it's about to have a comeback. The Ripper burst back into the headlines on February 17th. Headline: Jack the Ripper threatens invasion of Gainesville. Gainesville, Georgia was and is a small community 60 miles north of Atlanta. The report out of Gainesville was that a mysterious letter had arrived at the police headquarters there. It had an Atlanta postmark, so they knew it was mailed from Atlanta. The letter was written, quote, in a legible hand and in flaring red ink, end quote. Here is what the letter said. To the Chief of Police in Gainesville. Dear Sir, I will soon visit your city. Undoubtedly, you have heard of my work here in Atlanta. It has not been a consequence to what I will do in Gainesville. You had better prepare for me and see that the Negro women behave. Signed, Atlanta's Black Jack the Ripper. The name was signed on the image of a hand-drawn dagger dripping with blood. While we don't have a picture of this letter, I've recreated it to the specifications mentioned and posted it in the vault. This must have sent the newsmen into a frenzy. Everyone who followed the original Jack the Ripper story from the 1880s knew that the killer had written threatening and ominous letters to the London police. In fact, if you go to London, you can still see some of the original Jack's letters also written in red ink. This is a pretty common calling card for serial killers. Lots of modern serial killers have written letters to the police and journalists, or they just left them at the scene of the crime. That list includes the Zodiac Killer in California, the BTK Killer in the Midwest, and the notorious Son of Sam, who killed women in New York. When the local Gainesville paper published a report about the letter, Gainesville's black community completely freaked out, as would be expected. Furthermore, if fear of a bloodthirsty killer invading your community wasn't enough, the article notes this additional outrage. Much trouble also is being encountered by white people regarding the service of Negress cooks, the majority of whom have been afraid to leave their homes after dark. Once again, black people are worried about getting their throats cut, while white people are worried about getting their cornbread. Gainesville police thought the letter was a hoax, but not totally, I suppose. The final sentence of the article states that they would still, quote, take precautions against possible outrages, end quote. So, was this it? Was the Ripper getting bolder? Was he slowly pulling back the veil on who he was? Would he take his Atlanta killing show on the road, or on the tracks, rather? And of all the towns in Georgia, why Gainesville? That's next time on CATLICK. CATLICK is recorded in Atlanta's historic Cabbagetown neighborhood. Executive producer, Walnut Ridge Harmon. Original music and sound design by Duciel. Cover art by Rachel Eleanor. CATLICK Instagram Fan of the Week, Katie Mowers. CATLICK Instagram Hashtagger of the Week, Melissa Wilson. CATLICK Hater of the Week, Renan77, who thinks BT is, quote, beyond irritating and annoying. Don't forget to check out catlick.com for apparel and merchandise inspired by the CATLICK era. Of course, while you're there, don't forget to sign up for The Vault. It's our big CATLICK scrapbook that lets you see all the things I talked about in this episode. It's less than the price of an old-fashioned in New York. And finally, CATLICK is independently written and produced by me, BT Harmon. And I'd like to remind you to save old buildings, build bike lanes, and vote for public transit. We'll see you in the next episode.